The CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. The presentation was delivered with slides. To view those slides, or to learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. Hi everybody, my name's Paul McGee. I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research here at the University of Canberra. I want to start by acknowledging that we are here on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I'd like to pay my respects to all elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge all First Nations people here today in the room or online. So today it's my pleasure to introduce Ben Ennis-Butler. Ben is a senior lecturer here at UC in design. He has, in his own words, spent many late nights turning messy cultural heritage data into mostly functional web-based interfaces. His broader practice spans data visualisation, interface design, digital storytelling and user experience. And Ben has contributed to research projects for the National Gallery of Australia, the British Council, the ACT Government and the ARC-funded Heritage of the Air project. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage today.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of our lands and their contribution to country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today we're going to go on a deep dive into various digital mapping projects that I've found myself working on over the last couple of years. I'm going to talk about some kind of theoretical concepts, just to show that this kind of stuff is framed within a deeper framework, rather than just about making pretty pictures for the screen. And then I'm going to talk through some of the 3 case studies that I've span about the last 5-6 years. You'll see that they will talk about different approaches to data and dealing with data and how to get information into a format in which case you can actually map it in a digital way. And then I'll through that discuss some of the challenges and things that have emerged through these different projects. So most of my work sits within these 3 theoretical concepts. There's a concept of overview. I'll talk about that in a moment. So that's from an article in the 2000s. There's the infamous visual information seeking mantra by Ben Schneiderman in 1996. That's probably the most important theoretical framework that all my work has been. And then visual data exploration, which is very much about understanding that, in order to understand data, you need to be able to interact with it in some way. And I'll explain what they are, but hopefully you'll be able to see these kind of approaches come to life through the different projects. So the visual information seeking mantra, has anyone heard of that before? Yes, great. That's a good sign. Ben Schneiderman released this in 1996, and it's essentially a step-by-step process that describes any experience that someone's having with an interactive project. So he says, overview first, zoom and filter, details on demand. And he makes the argument that any successful interface or digital experience should provide the user with some kind of an overview, and then they should be able to zoom and filter within the same display and then get additional information on demand. So if you think about Google Maps, that's what you're getting. You're getting an overview of the whole world or whatever. You can zoom in to your chosen point, you can click on it and get more information. Lots of the work I've done has really tried to test this in different ways. Now you get into all kinds of different technical challenges when you start adding different devices that people are accessing this web-based stuff on. Whether it's a computer, whether it's a tablet, an iPhone, things like that. You run into all different kinds of technical challenges, but just think that in the background there's this kind of main overarching theoretical concept there. He goes deeper into how you can display more information in that, but I'm really focused on that overview first, zoom and filter, details on demand. Now the concept of the overview is crucial in all of this work. If you can see an overview of the data, then you can understand or you can make assumptions about it, which you can then test by interacting with it. So that's the kind of key thing. Now, the sense or the idea of actually making an overview is actually incredibly complicated, particularly when you're thinking about how many items you might have and how many items you're trying to display at once. So if you've got the examples I'm going to show, there's maybe one of them has about 2,500 boxes or items on a screen. That's about the extent of which you can provide a useful overview where someone can still interact with it. I've made the argument before that in data visualization, people often try to provide an overview through like a network graph or something like that, where there's just so much data that's completely overwhelming. And that's not going to be a good experience. The only way to make that more positive is to be able to interact with it. So to be able to actually zoom in and focus on the areas which you find interesting. So this overview is overarching there. Green's idea is that, picking up on what Schneiderman talked about, and just by saying that once you add interactivity to it, then it's much more successful, this concept of the overview. If it's just a static thing, then it can be difficult to comprehend. And we'll talk about it, and you'll see in the examples. And then the visual data exploration is very much about making the display of the information interesting in a way that you do want to engage with it. So basically, if it looks crap, you're going to off-put the user straight away, and they won't want to engage with it. If you kind of try and make it look sexy in some way or make it look cool, by using visual perception things like color and shape and scale and all those kind of different techniques, then you will hopefully encourage the user to actually start exploring it. Then there's all these other technical and design challenges. So, these are the things, the everyday things that people who engage in creative code just, kind of deal with, and there's lots of challenges there that we have to work through. So let's jump into them. So we've got 3 examples that I'm going to talk about today. So some of you might have seen me talk about these in the past. There's passenger cards. We have the creative industries map, and then more recent work about the NCDC unearthed. And I'm so glad to see so many of my collaborators here today. Let's talk about passenger cards first. This comes from a project for the Heritage of the Air, ARC funded, I already said project, but that Tracy Ireland led. This is kind of the earliest of these examples, and I produced this work with Mitchell Whitelaw, who's now at ANU Design. Passenger cards takes data from the National Archives of Australia, incoming passenger cards in Australia. So, when you fill in that card on the plane, those have been going since kind of the early 1950s, and they're all digitised and they're available in National Archives. They look like that, or these blue ones. If you go to the National Archives website, you have to search for them. Now, search, as some of you may have heard me talk about before, search is a bad way of accessing information, especially if you don't know what you're looking for. So you can't search for something effectively unless you know what you're looking for. So when you go to Google, you type something in, you look at the results, you amend accordingly, and you go through this kind of spiderweb process as you delve down trying to find what you want. This blue grid is what happens if you return a search for incoming passenger cards in New South Wales in 1964, which is the year that everyone talks about because that's when the Beatles came and their passenger cards have been scanned first. The information, you can see it's really, really rich. We've got, full name, this person, the nationality, racial origin, sex, age, conjugal condition, single, this person's a priest. Their intended address in Australia. Some of the addresses are actually, they have the full address, including the number, street number. So it's, and length of stay, in that case, indefinite. So you can start to see these really interesting trends about where people are coming from and, where they end up. And you have the aircraft information there as well. But this stuff is kind of hidden, right? Unless you're actually looking at those individual cards, it's very difficult to see those patterns. So passenger cards was a way, hopefully, of showing that come to life. But the card, there's a really bad example of one which is basically illegible. The card, when it's digitized, the information isn't actually available in any useful way. So we have an image of the card, but we don't actually have the text on the card. So part of the challenge is to get the text on the card into data, a format that we can use. And so lots of these things, you'll see I've started building all these different tools to actually deal with getting the information from the card into a format which we can use. So in this case, we had a transcription website where you can see the information that we want is transcribed in that form. And then we actually paid students to transcribe it for us. We tried to use Mechanical Turk, but they said, no, there's not enough cards, even though there's about 1,500 odd cards in this box. You know, looking at this now, looking back at this project now, this is something I would be very interested in running through a large language model and extracting that information through some kind of AI thing, right? You'd be able to pull that out. Maybe not that one, but certainly there's lots of information on those cards where we saw with that previous one where you could easily imagine extracting that. So if we went to what the interface kind of ends up looking at, this one it's not actually interactive, which is a departure from those previous works I've done, and also, you know, the kind of ideas that we say you need to have in order to be successful. And it's an animation. So, you know, the plane flies from wherever it comes, you know, departs from and flies to the city. We see the passenger card for that passenger, and you can also see the plane that they were flying on at the time. So we start to see this kind of idea of the overview here, right? We're showing lots of different pieces of data within one interface and allowing you to build this kind of understanding. And as you let it go, you see more and more of these kind of journeys being undertaken. The colours over here, you know, you might note that that is the Qantas colour, right? So we're using very subtle hints about what plane service they were on, obviously the actual images of the planes, and this kind of, we've tried to go for a bit of a retro feel here. This one, I love this one because it's an address in Canberra, Boulderwood Street, in Turner, as a radio technician, but, you know, for 3 months. So you can see these kind of, you see people flow on and the different routes they've come from. So it's quite a lovely, I think quite evocative kind of way of looking at that data, which otherwise is hidden, you know, in the depths of the archives. And this is the classic problem. Our national institutions, they digitise everything, they put it online, and then it's kind of left there. And there's this hope that, you know, maybe somewhere down the track, someone will think of some way of accessing and dealing with it. Let's move past passenger cards and return to the kind of classic style interface. So this project was completed during COVID, actually. And it was, we were commissioned by the ACT government. So when I say we, the project was led by our previous dean, Jason Bainbridge, and Jen Webb and Kathy Hope. And we were commissioned by the ACT government to do a scan of the creative industries across the ACT. And as part of that, a promise was made, which is kind of where the title of this talk comes from. The promise was made to get that information or that data we've collected and just put it on a map, which sounds so easy, right? You just talk to lots of people, find out where they live or where they work, and just plot that on a map. But of course, there are major problems with that approach. One, you have to collect the data. That's one problem. That in itself is a significant problem. You know, how do you collect it? What format do you put it into? You know, how do you deal with data inconsistencies and all that kind of stuff? Here's an example of an Airtable. Airtable's like Excel on crack. That you can have different kind of categories in it. This is called JSON, JavaScript Object Notation. That's essentially the raw format that any data you want to be able to make something ends up in that format. So it comes from the table kind of view like that and ends up like that. The problem with this project was, well, there were lots of problems, but one of the main problems was that the government wanted to see this view, this overview of where the creative industries were spread across Canberra, which is a great idea. But lots of them are private people working at home. So we couldn't reveal that information. You know, we can't say, you know, lots of people are working in Ainslie or Red Hill or whatever. So you immediately have this problem. We can't actually provide an overview of all the information. Even this table I had to filter out really carefully so that I didn't reveal anything extra there. But we discovered that, you know, even in the arts workers categories, there's a lot of people who work within the arts in Canberra, but they're working in the institutions and various things, and we can't reveal their location. We also discovered that there's lots of people who work in the exact same spot. So if you're working in the same spot in a map, you know, it means you have this like classic problem where dots are overlaid in exactly the same spot, which means that you can't click on them, right? So this is kind of what the map looked like. And I wouldn't say this is the most beautiful experience, but it gets the idea across. So you can see, we're using things like color, visual perception. The dots are there quite clearly. You can click on the different categories at the top to filter that data. So you've got the overview, you can zoom in on the map, so zoom and filter, and then you can click on something to get those details on demand, like that. So you do start to see, there's representation of creative industries across the ACT, which I think is really important. But you have this almost this sense of overwhelm, much like that earlier example I said about a network graph, classic data visualization, where people put too much data in and it's actually completely useless in many ways. And you can kind of see, there's lots of people obviously working in the city, there's lots of people on the south side, there's a bit in Dixon, but you don't get a great idea of the spread across the whole city and the intensity of some of those working areas. When we showed this to government, they were like, oh yeah, okay, that's cool. Can we show other things on there, like how many bars there are? As if there would be a relationship between the creative industries and the bars. And I said, no, but maybe we should. Maybe that would show, where you should actually be building these kind of things. But, you can see, like, this is a good example. There are things here which we know have locations, like Institute of Landscape Architects, but Basque's case, this guy who's taking old suitcases and putting speakers in them and selling them at the markets, we can't reveal his location. So this is trying to balance those two needs. Some information is on the map, and all the other information that's not is also kind of available there. This is one of those projects that, it was made, it was in the report, and then no one ever wanted to talk about it again for some reason. Yesterday, though, I got a call and asked, why isn't this public? And I said, I don't know, it is, it's on the web. And they said, well, we're going to show people. I thought, oh, okay, great. So, the other challenge, of course, though, is the data becomes out of date, right? Really quickly, especially if you're thinking about this kind of information where there's this massive transient workforce. We know what's happening in the creative industries, job losses, people moving around, even moving between the different places of work at a kind of rapid pace. So it's got these, all these kind of different challenges up in the air with something like this. What I really enjoyed about building this map in particular is, it was a rewarding experience to try and work out how to deal with, one, collecting the data, two, get it in a format which you could actually make something with, three, actually understanding how to do mapping kind of in a semi-successful way, and four, using, in this case, AngularJS to output this map, but with two-way data binding, which is quite exciting in some ways. So those two are they're kind of the small early examples. Now we're going to get into the more interesting, more recent work. So NCDC Unearthed, I know you all know about it because Sally talked about it a couple of weeks ago, or months ago, whenever it was, some period in the past. This is a great project which is building upon work that we've started to do as a collective, thinking about mapping architecture in Canberra. And it's actually something that I, not as an architect, have been very interested in for a long time, where we're thinking about, we have all these great examples in Canberra of really significant architecture that are either getting lost or demolished, or people just aren't aware of the kind of strength of them or the beauty of it in many ways. And going back to the National Archives briefly, the National Archives has all the images of the Canberra housing series. So all the houses which were built in Canberra by the government originally, all their plans and everything are on there. Now, Tim Sherratt, who used to work here at UC before he moved to Tassie, he was a fantastic data guy. He wrote a script which he shared an open source software with, where you could use it to scrape the images off the National Archives site. So before they changed their National Archives, before they changed their service, I managed to download all 25,000 different images of all those Canberra housing projects. And they're just sitting on my computer just waiting for their moment in the sun. But they're fantastic because they're showing that the rich integrity and the rich kind of detail of what was happening in Canberra in the really early stages of the city. And lots of them, of course, are getting knocked down and turned into horrible McMansions. So I think it's a really interesting project to kind of come to. That's a background to NCDC Unearthed. Though this project is like, I'd like to think of it as, it's like the test case. It's like the, let's see all the different things which could go wrong. Sally's going to be like, what do you mean? Nothing went wrong. The things that you don't see that are actually going on behind the scenes is kind of what I wanted to talk about. So, this is, I have already warned Sally I'm going to talk about this, but this is a classic approach in, most research projects people would know about. How am I going to collect the data? Where am I going to save this information so that it's easily accessible, so it's shareable? I've been to so many conferences where people say, oh, we just need to create a database. We'll create a database, right? You create it and then no one ever sees it again. I've tried to avoid doing that by using Airtable, but it's come to a point, I think this is the last time we're going to go down that route before we actually have to go down to creating the database. So this is an example of the research being collected right at the very early stages. It's in Word. It's a table, yeah. It was 17 pages long. It's, I would say it's probably what you should never do, but we're learning here. And the only reason I say that is because to get something to display it on a map, it needs to be structured. So any kind of data that you want to then display on a website in any way has to be structured in a way that you can easily loop through it. Because when you write in your code, you're saying, for each item, I want the title to go over here, the date to go over here, the address to be here, and so on. So when you have things like, in this case, we have like Lachlan Court and then it says Barton below. That's 2 bits of information that should be separate, right? So this is a kind of classic problem. So I'm not picking on you, Sally, in any way. It's chronological, yeah. It's great. It's rich. 17 pages of really amazing stuff. So you get information like this, and then you have this incredible challenge of how on earth do I get that into a format which I can work with. And this is that information then taken back into Airtable. Now, how on earth did I get it into Airtable? In the past, I would have done it manually, right? Copy cell by cell, or try and get it into Excel and then try and get it out of Excel into Airtable because it's a comma separated value kind of thing. In this case, I went straight to AI. I went straight to ChatGPT and I said, I've got this horrific Word document. Can you tell me how to get this out in some way that's some kind of structured format? And we went backwards and forwards, and I was able to get it into a format where I could copy and paste it into this thing. So that's great. So then you get the title, year, kind of address details, and the architect stuff. Now, the classic problem, the biggest problem in any map is you actually need the latitude and longitude, right? You can't plot it unless you've got the latitude and longitude. Now, you can see though, if we looked at that previous thing, we've got the address, but we don't have the lat long. And in many cases, the address might just be like Barton Offices, Kings Ave, Barton. Like, we know where that is, right? But the computer doesn't know. So that means that you then end up with this horrific position where not only have you had to get the data into the format, but then you now need to work out how on earth you're going to get the latitude and longitude for all 17 pages. I can't remember, there's about 150 items. Luckily, there's a process called geocoding where you give it the address and it will return, it's a service, and it will return the lat long. Unfortunately, though, it's always wrong. Or very often wrong. And you can see none of those are wildly out. I mean, there's a few missing there. Most say minus 35 to begin with. So at least they're in Canberra. Often when you first do this process, there's some in Canberra, there's some over there, there's, some in New York. They're all over the place. And so then the next step is to go back and then, okay, find that one, actually find the latitude and longitude and so on. In the past, I've had to do that manually. So I've literally gone into Google Maps, found the building by looking at Street View or whatever, clicking on it, then looking in the URL for the latitude and longitude and then copying that back manually into the file, which is awful. That's just not a good way to use anyone's time. So in this process, I asked ChatGPT to basically geocode those addresses for me, and it did a pretty good job. I was genuinely surprised at kind of how well it worked, but it's it's still not perfect. So I went back again, and here's my experience. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about AI, obviously because everyone's talking about AI, it would be remiss of me not to talk about AI, but it's that I think it's, there's all these criticisms about it, but there's it provides really useful possibilities, particularly for researchers who are coming into this space. And there's lots of tasks which take up a huge amount of time, that are taking up all this amount of time which would be better spent actually working on, what you want to. And I think we all have probably had that experience in some way, some kind of menial task, which is just before you know it, you've lost 10 to 15 hours, This is very common in creative code. You start building something, you get one error, you've lost your whole day, you come back to it, you lose another day, and finally I've missed a comma somewhere along the way, right? So in this case, I said, what I want essentially is a map showing those locations, and then I want to be able to drag and drop the location to the right spot, and then you export that data back out to me so that I don't have to manually copy it. Then I can still check it as I go. And incredibly, it worked almost instantly, which was life-changing. And if I'd had it when I was doing my PhD, I think it could have saved a huge amount of stress, and I'd probably have a lot more hair. So this is what it output. It's not the most beautiful looking thing, but it works. And that's the most important thing. It's enough to very quickly allow me to drag locations around. So you can see, it's kind of plotted them all. And you can see, like here, these are things that are in the exact kind of same spot. The previous, like the Creative Canberra map, where they're in exactly the same spot, they overlaid on each other. And I actually had to manually move them off by like 5 or 6 pixels to make sure that you could still see them. In this case, if they overlapped exactly, I could just move them on this, just drag it to the right a little bit, because the exact location does matter in these ones. And there are buildings here where we all kind of knew where they were, but we don't actually know anymore, right? So things that have been knocked down, like the Stuart Flats, unless you grew up in Canberra or you remember where those buildings were, it's hard to actually find them now. So by looking at this, though, I could kind of do dual research, work out exactly which buildings were where. Of course, it relies on your knowledge of the city to understand, where these places are on that. You click around, drag and drop, great fun. It outputs it as CSV, so then I could copy it back into that raw data. And then ultimately, we could kind of get to the interface working. And you can see what I've done here, right? I've done the kind of sneaky academic thing. I've used the same code each time, right? Just building upon it. I've tried to change the interface though, to deal with these kind of issues here. So, in the creative industries one, we had a smaller map, lots of data. In this one, we have a bigger map because the map itself is an important element of the interface. And we have the kind of selected item and also the filter. So you can see, though, we stay all within that same screen. So it's about giving you that overview. You can zoom in and filter on it. You can get the details on demand. Some items have photos like that one, the Park Royal Motel, unfortunately, knocked down. On this one, the address we had was Northbourne Ave. But we found it, didn't we? So we start, we have these really kind of interesting ideas, I think, coming back. Unfortunately, though, for this one, there's one major technical issue that I wasn't able or haven't resolved, mostly because I ran out of time. Does anyone want to guess what it is? No one's going to it on their mobile phones? Major problem. Major design problem. It's not topographical? Well, no, it's not, but you can tilt it. So, when you're building these maps, you're using other services to actually make the maps. Google Maps would be one of them, right? This is made with Mapbox, which is free for researchers. And they provide you with the tiles, but you can change the colors of them in this case. From a technical perspective, you render the map in the background, and where I'm actually drawing the dots over the top in HTML and CSS. So in terms of web kind of tech, it's very basic. And then it's just in JavaScript, which actually renders that. Mapbox does these cool things like that, where you can tilt the map if you want. So it will render the buildings to a point, so you can kind of tilt and zoom in. You can also, of course, geolocate yourself and so on, and tweak it like that. But it doesn't work on mobile, which is problematic because obviously most people are visiting, viewing these things on the mobile. Now, I haven't resolved it because I ran out of time in one way, but I'm kind of in two minds because it's such a immersive experience that you kind of want to be viewing it on a large screen. That's how I'm thinking, but I think it would be very rewarding to kind of do this as a walking tour, where it could show you, those locations, in which case the interface would have to be completely different. The beauty of getting the data in the right format, so all that initial work, is that once the data is in the format, then you could very easily make these different kind of interfaces depending on your context. So, it'd be great if you're just in the city somewhere and you said, I wonder what's over there. Oh, I'm going to go and look at that. And maybe it guides you in somewhere. And then maybe you can attach other information to it as well. Audio tours, once you start thinking about linked open data, which everyone used to throw around, that term. But linked open data, can we find more information about that park or motel from, say, Trove or some other kind of digitized repository easily? So I think in terms of the experience, the user experience, and I'm thinking back to kind of my overarching principles, would Ben Schneiderman be happy with this? I think, you get this overview. Canberra is small enough that you can provide an overview and view it all in one screen, as long as there's not too many options. You get you can zoom in and filter it, and you get the context, the details on demand there. In some early research that I've completed, I wrote about this concept of focus and context within one, and that's really viewable here, because a common approach would be to click on it and go to a new page. And if you go to a new page, you lose your context, right? So if you don't know necessarily the area very well, then you don't necessarily understand that relationship. And that's what I'm trying to do in all of these things. Provide as much information as possible within the one screen. So without having to go and depart, to lose track of where you're at, which then also allows you to easily continue that process of exploration if you want to. What else about it? It's very slow. The classic problem. It's slow because I'm loading all the data at once. You could clean up the data to make sure that it was faster, but I thought it was easier in that way. So basically, I've just been thinking about this and AI and things in the last couple of days, and I really think that there's this, to speed up some of that initial stuff is just, the opportunities are endless. Even last week I've been working on a project for the Sheila Foundation, John Crother's collection of women artists in Australia, and they've been collecting all this data. It's much like that Word document, it's kind of all over the place. But AI allows you to very quickly get that data into a format which you can work with. And I think that's a really important thing for lots of people, just to think about, okay, how could I use these tools to make my processes easier and actually allow me to focus on what's interesting to me, rather than getting stuck down in this hardcore kind of technical area.
Thanks. Lovely talk. With the AI step process in cleaning your data and making it usable and stuff, how do you then deal with reproducibility of, say, something goes wrong or you get more data, and then having to do those same steps again when a lot of generative AI will come up with something new, no matter if you ask it to do the same thing again.
Yeah, the hallucinations. Yes, so I've taken an approach of two ways. I've tried both. One, asking it to write you the script to clean it up yourself. And so running it in Node.js, for example, I don't like Python, but if I give you a CSV file or whatever, can you then give me a script which will turn it into the right format and then export it back out again? Which in theory means that because the data format has to be so specific that you know that it's not going to do anything weird. And at least then if it's running locally, it can't add anything into it, in theory. The other approach is to literally, so first I would say, make sure that you've turned off the setting to allow them to train the model on your data. That's the most important thing. And then upload the data and tell it, do not add anything extra into this. And then cross-check it. So if you've said, here's a CSV, or the Word file, it's kind of all over the place. Okay, here's an Excel file or whatever. Then at least I could check the two and look and see that nothing's gone horribly wrong. But that is one of the dangers, big time. Yeah. an experiment, perhaps.
I've got a quick question. So Ben, you started with the Schneiderman principles, and they're based on this idea that we need an overview first to kind of orient ourselves, I suppose. I was just reflecting how opposite that is to the way we do things, say, in literature, where if somebody starts a novel with an overview, it's exactly what you don't want. What you want is the specific detail that compels you in.
Yeah.
You know, why doesn't that work? And also, are there ways of thinking outside these Schneiderman principles? Like, are they necessarily, you know, the 10 Commandments?
That's a bold move. Definitely, there are definitely ways of moving beyond that, and I think that's where this kind of challenge between designing for large screens and small screens comes into play. I feel personally, you know, if it's on a small screen, I can have a more connected experience with it. So maybe the overview isn't as important. You know, maybe it's that exactly, where you can tempt someone in with, you know, tidbits of information that might encourage them to continue through that process. You know, essentially you can essentially make a story of some way, or some way to communicate information that through your data that gives the illusion that it's been generated just for the person. Does that make sense? So as an example, in the Cooper Hewitt Museum, Smithsonian Museum, they have captions which combine cataloguing information into a paragraph. So it will say, like, you know, what's an example? Like Joseph Albers, you know, was born in blah, blah, blah in 1964. And so they add that information in. You know, he works with paintings primarily in this format. And so they add in the cataloguing information, but render it as a paragraph. So it's, you know, it's much more humanising immediately than just seeing that cataloguing information in a list. I tried to do that on prints and printmaking with artist information. So saying things as simple as, you know, Margaret Preston was born here in this year, or she died in this, you know, in this location this year, which I think makes it kind of more humanising in that way. I don't know. I'm kind of going all over the place now. I'm thinking maybe I should go the other way and think, oh, I shouldn't give the overview.
Well, I am reflecting too on your example of the person standing in Civic, where you said, and they want to know, oh, what happens if I walk over there? What buildings are there?
Yeah. Which could be a
more novelistic kind of experience.
Yes, yeah.
Nick.
That's a good question.
Thanks, Ben.
That's all right.
That was really interesting. I was just drawn to your question of unfortunately we can't do this in a mobile way. And it took me back to some thoughts that I had a decade ago about bus stops. And the whole, what was current then, people were talking about augmented reality. So the idea that they didn't actually do that, but I wanted them to. You could point your phone at the bus stop and then it would tell you when the bus was going to arrive, because it could identify that. And I'm very aware that there's been developments in terms of identifying where you are.
Yep.
So I wonder whether that sort of extended augmented reality might be a way forward.
Yes, I think the answer is probably yes. Augmented reality, it's, as you say, you know, everyone's been talking about it for a decade, but nothing really seems to have happened in a way that the mass consumerism has, you know, grabbed it and run with it. I've seen it, you know, even in like early on, 2007, I was at a music festival where you could hold up your phone and it would tell you who was playing on the different stages. Yeah. You know, that's cool, but it doesn't, nothing's really kind of happened since. And maybe it's there have been some galleries kind of experimenting with it, definitely. I think even here at the NGA they were trying, there were some early experiments with it, but it's... Do you think that could make you more surveillable? Potentially, but you know, I would almost suggest that you're so surveillable anyway that it doesn't matter. That's probably the wrong approach, but there's so much data being captured about you all the time that it's just kind of, you know, beyond belief. Even, you know, like on a website, if I install Google Analytics or something, I can see a lot of information about my users, much more than they would understand is being revealed about them just through basic analytics. It's fairly horrifying. And then once you add, you know, a pixel, one of the Facebook ones, to all the different sites, you know, you can capture, Yeah, you could do mass surveillance very easily. But the AR thing, I don't know, maybe Joel and I will have to work on a project about bringing that to life. You know, that's an example where you can imagine if you're in the city, you do hold up your phone and it says go that way. There's a great, you know, modernist building, will go that way, and this great mid-century building, something like that. Could work really well. Why hasn't it taken off? Is it because, you know, Zuckerberg's put all his eggs in the other basket, the kind of more insane, what's it called? Extended reality thing? Yeah, which also hasn't taken off. Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting one. It's a good question. Why is it not there yet?
My experience at the moment about why extended reality really hasn't taken off is there is a barrier to entry, number one, and also it's just weird walking around with a phone, right? Like in games, they put in the kind of tilt mechanics that you can play with. No one uses them. They turn it off because it's an odd thing to do in public. But what I think the companies are doing, and doing quite well, is they are building that technology. It is becoming more accessible and more possible. And eventually we're going to get to wearable technology that isn't weird to wear. Maybe 50% of us are wearing glasses in this room. And that's when you'll start to see kind of the consumerism pick up around AR and VR. So like at the moment, you put a massive device on your head and you have to wear gloves to use VR, or you have to walk around like you're a tourist trying to find your location, and that is the kind of society doesn't find that acceptable, in my opinion, essentially, and based off some research that I've read. I had a couple of questions or thoughts, that kind of thing. Number one was like, have you played around with cluster mapping and stuff like that? And is it just too hard, or is it just, it's not as sexy as the dots because the dots kind of really represent the data in a better way?
Yeah, so cluster mapping is where if you've got lots of locations in the same spot, it draws a single larger circle, and then when you click on it, you know, it expands. Yes, I have played with it. I didn't like it because it does exactly that. You know, instead of getting your full overview, it gives you these kind of large circles which hide the kind of richness of some of that data. You know, I think seeing them kind of, splattered across Canberra, you know, immediately you're like, wow, it's chaos, which is very much what it is, right? There's this, you know, there's no kind of, there are kind of like centralized groupings, but they kind of are random. And depending on how you do the clustering, especially the smaller scale, it hides a lot of that detail. So that's the kind of logic there.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I was thinking the same thing. It would hide the map as well a little bit, where so you're not really getting a sense, or like you said, the overview of the data. The other thing I'm curious about, because obviously there's a lot of research projects around data collection that are very useful. And I like the idea of trying to look at prosumerism kind of thing in that process, where you make the consumer become the data kind of collector and putting that information in. The hardest thing about that is to be a prosumer, there has to be a value in it. Like if you go to Woolworths now, you have to check out your food and you need food. So you're just like, okay, I'll do it. Or back in the day, you know, fuel's a classic one where they'd fill up the car. Now we fill up the car. And so I'm really curious about if we can create a perceived value in these research projects to the consumer. Will they just do the effort for us and enter that data in?
Yeah, that's a good point. Most people would know about Trove and the newspapers, digital newspapers, which they're essentially getting the users to correct en masse. Like there's some phenomenal amount of corrections, which they're just doing it for themselves, right? No, for the public good. Yeah. Years ago, 2013, I went to the Museums in the Web conference, and there was a fantastic talk by a guy from Melbourne, Johnny Brownbill, working at Museums Victoria, and they had created, I can't quite remember what it was called, but it was like they showed an item from their collection and they asked you to catalogue it. And then, you know, people would go through it, and it was kind of fun. They'd kind of gamified it a little bit, and you go to the next one, oh, well, that's and then they would be sent to the curator, and the curator would approve whether or not it was legit, and then it was added into their collections, you know, software. So Victorian collections, that's right, yeah. And, you know, Victorian collections fantastic because it's getting down from the high-grade institutions down into, it's all the little local community groups like the, you know, Wonthaggi Mining Society and the Inverloch History Society and stuff. They all come in and they put their collections on there, and then you've got people cataloguing it. Really interesting, and that's all linked open data as well now. I think any chance you can get the...
NASA's done that with Galaxy Zoo, where you go
Oh, yeah.
and you you categorize
Galaxies.
galaxies. Yeah, and it's a thing. You just, if you have 5 minutes, you go on and it's massive data, like
Yeah.
crowdsourced data thing.
That's cool. And one of the things in the Canberra project or the NCDC stuff is I think you could, we want to get people's memories, right? We want to collect that information. So if we could build some kind of thing where it's like, hey, do you remember this building? Did you live here? Did you work here? What was it like? Can we share that in some way, whether it be audio or textual? That would be really interesting. And that's where I think Facebook is actually taking a lot of that work. And it's a matter of getting it out of Facebook, because if you join any kind of local community group, history group in particular, people will say, oh yeah, I went to school with, Johnny, and they did, I'm going to pick on Johnny now. But like these things like, and sharing all these incredible stories, which then if you could bring that back into your database, that really rich information is kind of crucial and getting lost quickly.
Well, it's collected by local museums and local historical societies.
Yes.
Other people you could be working with.
Yes, definitely, yeah. And so NCDC Unearthed was supported by the ACT government through the ACT Heritage Grant. And part of that is a book that we're proposing to write about everything, and I'll be writing about street furniture.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking them.